Hello, everyone, and welcome to APQC's December webinar, our last webinar of the year. And we're going to talk about how process and knowledge boost personal productivity. And APQC has been interested in productivity for as long as we've existed. It's in our name. And productivity is obviously important at the macro level, at the country level, at the organizational level. But it's also deeply important to us psychologically as individuals. We all want to be productive. It makes us feel better, and it frees up our time to learn and be creative and all the things that we want to do in our careers and lives. So it's in everyone's best interest to make individual employees and teams as productive as possible. It really is a win-win, but what we find is that few organizations have the right structure, the right support in place to really enable that and make it happen. And at APQC, we really wanted to understand both the drivers and the barriers to personal productivity. So earlier this year, we surveyed nearly 1,000 knowledge workers about how they think about productivity in the context of their jobs, what prevents them from being as productive as they'd like to be, and trying to dig in and understand some of the interventions and solutions that would move the needle in terms of their productivity. So today we're going to share some highlights from that research with a special role, because we are a process and knowledge focused organization, on the role that process and knowledge management play in that productivity narrative, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I'm really excited to get started. So my name is Lauren Trees. For those of you who don't know me, I lead our APQC's knowledge management research, and I'm here with my colleague, Holly.
Hi, I'm Holly Lyke-Ho-Gland. I'm our research lead for our process and performance management research here at APQC.
And this project has really been a 50-50 collaboration between Holly and me and our two practice areas. So we're very excited to be presenting the research together today and to a diverse integrated group of our process and knowledge and audiences across APQC's different areas. So our agenda really focuses in three main parts. We've tried to keep it simple today. The first is really looking holistically at productivity itself, how people define it and measure it, and why it matters to individuals and organizations. Then in the second section, Holly's going to take the lead and look at productivity from a process perspective, where people are losing the most time messing around with bad processes and how organizations can start to address that. And then I'm going to take over and look at this from the KM perspective, where knowledge flows create the biggest productivity bottlenecks for people, and which tools and approaches appear to move the needle in terms of boosting that productivity. And then we'll end with what for me was our last surprise finding about how process and knowledge affect the overall employee experience. So please talk to us throughout in chat. We will definitely leave some time for questions at the end, but we'll also be looking at that throughout and want to get your reactions and thoughts, and hope you guys will chat with each other. If you have questions that you specifically want us to answer, I do encourage you to put those in the Q&A, because sometimes we'll lose the thread of them in the broader chat. So productivity is a fraught and complex concept often, and all of us come to it, what we found is with our own biases, including Holly and me. And so when we sat down to map out this presentation, we decided to start by sharing some insights about productivity from the data that surprised us and maybe overturned some of our preconceived notions about what productivity means and how it works. And so before we jump into that, we wanted to get a little bit of a take on where y'all are coming from. So I think we were going to lead off with a poll.
Right. So the first thing we actually wanted to do is that idea of defining productivity, right? And what it means to you guys in your organization. So what best represents productivity in your organization? Is it efficiency? How fast can we churn out as many widgets as possible? Is it really then more about effectiveness? We're a quality organization and really doing work right is the most important factor for us? Or are we those kind of unique birds where we actually balance and we focus on both efficiency and effectiveness and how we define productivity?
I have so many things I could say about this, but I don't want to color the voting here because I'm very interested in where people are coming from on this question. So it should be a pretty easy one. We'll just leave it open for a couple of minutes and see. Couple of seconds. I always say minutes. Okay, so most people balanced best of both worlds. What do you think, Holly?
That makes me incredibly excited and happy to hear. I love the fact that, for so long, people have had kind of this skewed perspective. So let's go and see what actually close this up and see what the results from the survey showed as far as that goes. So one of the questions we asked people was, how do they define it? And this is probably the biggest surprise and also the happiest one for me. Going back to that biased view, right? So I come from the process side of the house. So when we think about productivity, we think in kind of that manufacturing perspective, right? We're looking at Fordism, we're looking at Toyota models. We're looking at how do we go about reducing costs? How do we make things go faster? How do we clean out waste? And that's kind of that process bias we saw. So it's always typically about efficiency in that area. But I was super excited because, effectiveness is just if not even more important to organizations and how they're defining productivity, much like you guys. But as far as that goes, because looking back, even though productivity is at our core, and even our founder, Jack Grayson, looked at the world of having this balanced perspective. He defined it as that you not only have to do things right, which is that efficiency aspect, but you also have to do the right things, which is where that effectiveness comes through. So again, this kind of result made me incredibly happy. We also added a couple of other things that were kind of intrinsically tied to this idea of doing things right and doing the right things. And that's really looking at how do we expand productivity in the organization to innovation, right? So when we're thinking about productivity and we're thinking about improvement, what is actually going to do more than incremental improvements and move the needle to find better ways for us to do work, as well as then kind of looking at how does productivity play out. Though we're talking about personal productivity, I always find productivity to be a team sport. So, and that looks like a lot of people are also defining it that way because it's about not just working through what you need to do to achieve your goals, but also about how that plays into what the organization needs, as well as your teams. So productivity then kind of expands beyond the borders. So overall, this, I guess, that was my biggest surprise and my happiest point as far as the data went.
And I think it's exciting to see this holistic definition of productivity. For me, one of the most surprising things was how why people want to be more productive, that kind of why behind the productivity. So when I think about driving at productivity, I tend to think about goals and targets and the incentives that we can give to get people to meet them. But when we ask people what motivates them to be more productive, the most common responses that we got were both intangible and profoundly personal. They want to feel like they're doing a good job. They have that personal drive. They want a better work-life balance. And many also want to decrease stress and anxiety. And to the extent that they are motivated by external goals, those tend to be either at the organizational level, so supporting the mission and vision of the organization, or at the team business unit level. They want to support a group of colleagues and a collective objective. So for the most part, what we're finding is that people are really intrinsically self-motivated to be more productive. And I think when you take a step back and think about the knowledge work jobs that so many of us have in the 21st century, this actually makes a lot of sense. We're not necessarily clocking in hours, at least a lot of us. We have a certain workload that we need to get through in however many hours it takes to get through it. And in order to do that, you really need that holistic productivity where you're being efficient so that you're not overly stressed and you have some time left to eat dinner with your family or do whatever you want to do, and to be effective so that you get that personal satisfaction and feel like you're contributing to something bigger than yourself and not wasting this 8-9 hours, 10 hours a day that you spend at work. So in this context, I see personal productivity as a survival skill for the modern workplace. But I don't think organizations and even individual contributors always see eye to eye on what productivity means and how it's measured.
And I think that was a big thing we saw over about the last year and a half, right? Was so this big question of how do we measure productivity? And then some of the horrible early things were such as like butts in seat. So how many hours is somebody working? That was our number one measure of productivity as people moved remote. So we really wanted to kind of dig in and really understand how do people measure it to manage productivity effectively? And how does that match with how they defined productivity, right? So one of the good things is we saw that 97% of the respondents said, yes, they actually have productivity measures that they're associated with. The second great part of that is if you look at here at kind of the measures as far as popularity of what they're being used for is, again, we see this great balance between efficiency and effectiveness. Quality being the number one was also kind of a surprise for me, because I know a lot of people struggle with how do we measure the quality of work, especially something that it can sometimes be very, very difficult to measure, such as the stuff that knowledge workers do. So how do we measure how great a report is? How do we measure how great the insights that we create for our customers are, just from like a personal example, right? So I was very, very excited to, again, see kind of this balancing act here as far as that goes. Because again, we're looking at efficiency. Efficiency typically look at capturing kind of the throughput of an individual. Most common one we've seen over time is, output to input divided by cost. Other ones are typically things like volume. How much work are we accomplishing? How many FTE hours are being put towards a specific task? Which also is utilization, cycle time, how quickly can we go through there? And then always the cost conundrum, when we're talking about efficiency of our work. And then the effectiveness, on the other hand, is really what captures the accomplishment or what we're trying to get out of the work that we do. Again, like I said, this has always been a place I think a lot of people have struggled with as far as some of those effectiveness measures, especially at the individual process level. But they can range from a lot of different things. They can be organizational wise. So looking at things like conversion rates, looking at things like customer satisfaction or retention, employee satisfaction, and even in manufacturing, first pass yield is a great kind of qualitative approach to measuring the effectiveness of the efforts that we do. So again, super excited here that we saw this kind of great balancing act between the measures as well as kind of how we're defining it into these two kind of spheres. The other great thing that we saw from the data perspective here is that 55% of the knowledge workers in the survey actually said that they were very, very happy and that their measures were effective at managing their performance. So that again, putting the kind of the data around that was really, really great. But the big question we have then is so we've got measures. Most people are using productivity measures at the personal level. They're a great balance, but how does that then play out to how productivity is being managed within the organization?
Oh, I jumped.
It happens to me all the time.
It won't go back. Here we go. There we go.
All right. So what we've seen here is that even though we've got data that's being captured, being collected, and being used to manage productivity, and people are happy with it, most of the way of approaching the measurement strategy and managing people's productivity is still really, really subjective. They're either relying on people to self-report their information and their statistics. Their manager does it by observation, which I know is why that measurement conversation came to such a head early on over the last year and a half, because managers didn't have quite as much insight and eyes on their employees. So they didn't understand, well, how do I know they're actually being productive? And then to a lesser extent, you start to see that they're actually tracking measures. Only a third of employers are actually tracking those productivity measures of the team or at the unit level. So I know you've got some thoughts on this also, Lauren.
Well, I think this is one of the areas where we really struggle. Somebody in the chat said that they like to think about things being efficiently effective. which I think is a great way to look at it. But most employers, they don't necessarily want to run a surveillance operation like all of the tools that we're hearing about, keystroke analysis. And if you look away from your computer, we're going to monitor that. But I do think there is a real underlying anxiety about productivity, especially in this sudden shift to more remote and hybrid work. And, I think at least part of that does stem from this lack of understanding behind what motivates people to be productive, which I assure you is not being monitored like kindergartners. And organizations know that quality is a profound component of productivity. We saw that in the measures on the last slide, and they know that they should measure it. But Holly, you say this all the time, it's hard. And the quality measures tend to be more time consuming to collect, more indirect, more subjective, and they don't always fit into the neat box of being a data-driven organization for a lot of firms. So I think a lot of people do get these subjective measurements like manager observation, but it's not necessarily on their goals or their scorecard because it's harder to turn into a number, and people worry about the subjective nature of that. So I do think that this overemphasis on quantity persists, even though no one really thinks it's a good idea. So I think that we still have that tension at play. And so we wanted to ask you, because we have a lot of questions about all of the people who are measuring quality as part of productivity. And we wanted to poll you about if your organization does measure quality, how it measures that, whether that's qualitative manager or team observation, whether you have specific metrics for quality, and those would obviously differ by industry and role, whether you're measuring that through customer surveys and feedback as a proxy for quality, or something else, which I would love for you to share in chat, because I'm sure we have not made a comprehensive list here. So somebody popped up and said that they're measuring using dashboards. So I don't know exactly what's on those dashboards, but I definitely think that quality makes sense as an index measure if there's a lot of different components that go into it, that you may want to not just look at one aspect of quality, but look at a couple of different ones.
An aggregate score or some form of dummy variable. Some ways people do it. And that's why you also see like customer surveys as kind of a dummy variable sometimes to measure quality, because you're wanting to know how happy the ultimate, way of showing how well your work is that the people who are consuming it are happy with it. So.
Okay, so the most common is the manager and team observation. I think that lines up with our data. And then a little more than half have some kind of specific quality metrics. A little more than half are using customer surveys or feedback, and a few people in the other. So people are kind of putting part of the efficiency is that its own measurement is auto-generated while developing and delivering the service or product. So some people have got those measures built in, obviously.
And another one said that they're using a checklist to measure completeness of the work as well. So can schedule and budget be part of the quality for the projects? You can look at it as part of the quality, unless you're kind of converting that then into cost or throughput. And then that tends to be more of an efficiency measure rather than a quality measure of what you're trying to use. Audit processes. All right, excellent. So thank you guys for helping kind of create some clarity around that idea of quality, because I know that's a place a lot of people that I've talked to have struggled with, which is how do I do that? But what we're going to do now is kind of take a little bit of a dive into process and its relationship with productivity. All right, so the first thing I really wanted to do was start looking at where do we see process-related productivity drains? And some of the questions that we asked were really around kind of three key ones that we see over and over again in the process area, right? And so the first one is creating or using workarounds for broken systems or processes. A lot of times when organizations don't dedicate time or effort into, kind of traditional or supportive process improvement programs, a lot of people wind up doing a lot of workarounds. So they're recreating their processes or finding ways to kind of just get the work done. And because it's, not standardized or anything like that. That can vary from time to time to time. So this kind of like eats away a little bit about taking out the time. I know one of the other big things of why people continue to use workarounds as well, I don't have time to do the improvement, or I don't have time to do the project that will fix this. But that you can see, on average is about 2.1 hours per knowledge worker per week spent recreating or developing workarounds. And the second one is then this idea of performing required work that serves ultimately no purpose, or busy work. And why this is also kind of a process challenge is because at the core of process management work, as well as lean, the idea is that you really should be focusing your efforts and the work that you do on what is valuable to the output that you want to achieve. So, and I know a lot of us have had to like check off this or go through this review or any of these kind of things that don't necessarily add value to the output, but that are just kind of part of what we do, updating manual Excel sheets, whatever it may be. And that's also costing about another 2 hours per worker per week. And then the last one is then really this idea of recreating processes for how work gets accomplished. When processes aren't standardized or they're not documented, or even if they are and nobody knows where to find them, you start to see that staff will often take a lot of time to have to rethink and recreate the process every time they go about doing that. Now, not only is that an issue as far as, the time drain from the individual, but also that it also creates some inconsistency issues and other things that we see as other productivity drains. So again, having to recreate the process because we don't know what it is, or it's not standardized, or we don't know where to find it, costs about another 2 hours. So if you kind of add all of this up, what we're looking at is that bad process is creating about 6 hours of productivity drain per worker per week. And that really adds up if you start thinking about it in the long term. So that means that we're losing 3 work days every month to these productivity drains. And if you look at that on a yearly scale, that means we're losing about 7.5 weeks of productive time for these kind of process related drains every year. So in addition to kind of just like the time component as well, what are some of the other kind of process gaps we wanted to understand that were really affecting people? And again, we see kind of some ones that shouldn't be really surprising because they kind of align with the business case for what process work does, right? Ad hoc or inefficient processes. So again, what we're looking at here is what we call the top 2 box, and that's the group that either agree or strongly agreed with the statement that you can see here on the screen. So again, ad hoc, inefficient processes create some time sink. A lot of people have to think about what they do. They have to recreate the work every time they execute it. This also becomes a lot of time. Then people are also creating a lot of time with unnecessary steps. So because again, they're inefficient processes. So not only are we having to recreate things because the processes are inefficient, we're having to come up with workarounds, or we're having to kind of waste time on those non-value added steps. A lot of people felt that their processes they used to do in their job were only in their head. And this is, again, kind of both an efficiency and an effectiveness issue because people, again, have to want to know they have to have the right information to execute their work. And again, going back to having to recreate processes because they're all in their head. But the biggest, I think, effectiveness issue also really comes because of inconsistency. So it kind of hits that quality perspective because if all the processes are in people's heads, everybody's going to be doing it slightly different with different results over and over and again. And that's going to negatively impact our customer satisfaction and our ability to kind of consistently create the same high level quality of product. And that kind of really then goes into the next problem, which is this idea that we asked people about if they left the organization. Most of them felt that the organization would have to relearn how to do certain tasks and process if they left. Because that information is tacit rather than written down, they're going to have to recreate from scratch how to do things, which is going to then impact new hire work. Again, you're going to have more time to ramp somebody up if they don't understand the process or you don't have a clear way to show them what the process is in your organization. So all 3 of these are kind of traditional things that we see as big process gaps in organizations. Our processes are ad hoc or they're not fit for purpose. People just have the execution of how they do work in their head. And that causes problems when you lose talent and you lose capabilities. I think the positive thing that I saw here actually made me a little happy was this fact that when we asked them about whether they were still having challenges of COVID-19 was accentuating the process-related productivity issues. And only about 43% said yes, which means 57% of the people didn't feel that this impact was very high. Now, I would beg to differ. I think about 2 years ago, the numbers would probably have been reversed, where the majority would have said yes. But COVID actually wound up being an opportunity for process groups to kind of help triage and do a lot of work early on to help their organizations, because we found that there were a lot of broken processes because they were done by a culture of heroes. They were reworking a lot of processes for digital kind of execution, either through automation or through collaboration places as well. So those are kind of the big things, again, kind of reinforcing a lot of things we already understand about the link between process and productivity. So because we have problems, that also means there needs to be some process related solutions. So we asked the respondents about a whole slew of different types of actions and on whether they do them, whether they think they would make a difference. And we really kind of measured 5 of them in the process sphere, but we're only going to really talk about the first 3, and that is standardization and documentation of processes. So creating consistency and codifying how we execute work, streamlining and simplifying processes, which means really kind of removing those unnecessary steps and focusing on the value of what we can provide. And then my favorite is empower employees. So how do we tap into people to help us identify improvement opportunities and help drive that kind of success forward? Now, the other 2 we cover in the report, but we didn't have enough time to unpack, is we also looked at data-driven decision-making and its impact, as well as tools like automation and other technology solutions. So let's start with that first one, standardizing and documenting processes. So almost half of the organizations actually said that their organizations document their processes, which makes sense, especially if a lot of the organizations said they had BPM teams. Documentation is typically one of kind of the first steps of what we do as far as that goes. Process, it refers to kind of basically just codifying and creating a visual or tangible format of how work gets executed. So it's easy for people to understand and recreate and execute that process on a regular basis. Now, the format of the documentation varies widely. It's really just a matter of picking which type works best for your organization. But documentation itself has a lot of benefits. It outlines the steps clearly and puts them in order, and which helps create clarity, like we said. Also, typically when we're looking at documentation, we're also understanding some information that goes around that process, right? So what are the inputs? What goes into the process? Who provides that information? And then what are the outputs and standards of what it should look like? And who's the customer that's going to receive it? However, only about less than a third of the people felt that documentation alone would really kind of drive the productivity forward very well. So instead, what they also started to see was standardization, and standardization was also important. As we saw with some of the problems, ad hoc and inefficient processes were a huge drain. So process standardization really focuses on establishing a set of consistent, effective processes that can be carried out across different groups. It requires understanding the current state or states, depending on the way the processes are in your organization, and then coming up with the best fit to be state, which really kind of looks at driving and getting rid of those inefficiencies. So from the idea of how does that help productivity? Well, like I said, it requires documentation. That's why these 2 are connected, which means it's taking that information and taking that processes out of people's heads, which is some of the big productivity sorry about that. Some of the big productivity issues that we saw. It's also really good at standardizing and helping from the knowledge perspective as well, because good standardization and documentation includes capturing process knowledge. So all of that information that's around, how do we execute this process? Business rules, lessons learned, standards, all of these things, which really then helps kind of address some of the other productivity challenges Lauren's going to talk about, such as like knowledge about how to do the work, knowledge on the process is also only being in people's head. It also helps reduce the amounts of variance, which can create clarity on how to execute work and kind of help remove a lot of that confusion. So overall, it really kind of helps reduce those issues that process is tacit. It helps identify and help us drive towards standardized and documented processes and really kind of impact and make sure that people have access, tangible access to information, rather than it just residing in Bob over two cubes over's knowledge. So the second kind of one we talked about was the streamlining and simplifying of processes. So knowledge workers felt that documentation alone was not enough because a lot of their processes they felt were too complex. Complex processes can really kind of make performance management ungainly, and it can cause organizations then to really rely on those efficiency measures. So the more complicated the process is, the harder it is to define the value or the steps, and really then kind of drives that way of helping a lot of people focus then on those kind of throughput cycle time type of measures. Also, organizations can streamline their processes to focus on critical work and managing kind of the value stream. So we saw organizations really what they need to do as far as how the streamlining approach goes is assess their processes, prioritize what pieces of the process are important based on value, and simplify or remove unnecessary tasks. Now, this is at the heart of lean in a lot of ways, right? When we're talking about process work. But a lot of the times people kind of overlook that value component when they're going through and leaning out their processes. This is also a great place where we see a lot of people use tools like process mining and automation. They're really, really well set up to help with the streamlining and simplification of them. How does simplification help out productivity? The more complex a process gets, the more things that can go wrong with it. Additionally, the more complex the process gets, the more likely it is to create confusion for the end user. There's a lot of reasons why processes can get too complex. They could drill down way too deep in a level. They could and also have too many business rules, if thens surrounding around them. They could also have a lot of high levels of variation because we want to make sure we capture every permutation of how a process could get executed. But simplifying really just requires a standardizing at a much higher level. I've heard the phrase harmonizing quite a bit over the last 6 months and really looking at standardization at a much higher level, typically around a level 3, so the process area, and then really pushing a lot of the complexity down into standards of work, more kind of detailed business rules, as well as desktop procedures, which is where that complexity really should live as far as being in much more smaller bite-sized pieces for workers. So they don't have to tear through and understand which path is the best fit for them. So consequently, the analysis found also that knowledge workers and organizations that kind of simplify their processes are less likely to report a lot of kind of process inefficiencies and a loss of tacit knowledge because they are clear and the steps to get to the information, what they should do, are much more easy to follow. Additionally, it also has reduced the likelihood to cite some process-related issues. Knowledge workers in the streamlining areas are also really likely to see statistically significant less reduction or significantly less time spent on providing duplicative information or repeating the same updates or answers. Again, by streamlining the steps of providing information to 5 different places or different people, and instead creating just a single step with a single output area is just kind of one example. So the third kind of process related is absolutely one of my favorite areas, and that is empowering employees. So it's last but definitely not least, and it's kind of a standard piece of kind of the process management toolkit, right? So empowering individuals to suggest productivity improvement is kind of the gold standard when we're talking about process improvement within the organization. And this requires really moving towards this idea of a culture of continuous improvement. And that really then kind of looks at how we've gone about empowering our employees with the right tools, the right information, the right amount of time and incentives to really kind of make sure that they're keeping the eye above the flow to help improve how work gets done. Now, frontline employees are really the closest to the work that's performed. So consequently, they're also the group that's most likely to see inefficiencies and understand what could be good solutions for those inefficiencies. As far as that goes, and why you want to empower the employees themselves, what we found in continuous improvement work is if you go through and kind of do audits sometimes, or if you go through and do the interview approach to help improve it in productivity or kind of how the process is working, you go with your standard checklist of, you know, what's right, what's wrong, walking through your process, what would you fix? A lot of that information is done then in hindsight, and you may not be able to capture all the nuances or the information necessary. And by empowering your employees to be able to identify this information, they're able to identify it in the flow of work, not forget about it, elevate it, and then start working towards finding ways to make it better. Now, additionally, because this frontline thing not only makes employees the best possible people to help identify improvements, it also really helps get them involved and helps drive productivity in other ways. Because people, when they are empowered to feel that they have control over the work that they do, it also helps weave into that idea, that drive that we mentioned earlier, which is everybody wants to do a good job. And by owning the type of work you do, that also increases the likelihood that you not only want to do your job right and do it well, but you also want to make sure that the processes and how work gets executed in general is as good as it can possibly be. So it also helps, again, reduce some of the productivity drains that we've seen. Again, people who are close to the execution of work understand what brings value and what actually drives kind of the needle as far as the work they're trying to execute. So it reduces the amount of time on busy work. And again, providing that duplicative information or repeating the same answers over and over and again are kind of easy wins as far as getting rid of that kind of duplicative efforts. So as we can see here, what we find is that a lot of these process drains, as well as kind of the solutions, are kind of vetted and supported by the data from the survey. And we know a lot of these are kind of how process and productivity work together, just in general, by making sure things are documented, making sure you have some standards, making sure it's simple and easy for people to execute, and then giving people a sense of ownership about the work they do, which will increase their morale, as well as help you identify really sticky places to improve.
Thanks, Holly. And now I am going to jump into the knowledge management side, both where inefficient knowledge flow is hurting people the most, and the actions that we think can help mitigate some of the gaps and bottlenecks that we see in the data. So organizations that are thinking about investing in knowledge management often come to me, come to APQC and say, we need to make a business case. How can we understand the impact of doing nothing? Can we quantify how much that costs us in comparison to the cost of setting up a KM program? And those are always very difficult calculations to make, since the impacts of bad KM tend to be hard to measure and broadly dispersed across the workforce. But when we dig into this productivity data, the downstream effect of bad KM really comes to life, at least for me. And I think we see people spending a lot of time on inefficient knowledge flow. And we've got 5 categories up here that we asked about. I tend to collapse those into 3 main buckets. The first is around internal communication and collaboration. So the time people spend on internal team sites, email, chat, those kinds of things. The second is search and discovery. So looking for information and documents and data, but also looking for people to answer questions and provide expertise. And then the third is unnecessary duplication. So recreating information or work that already exists elsewhere in the organization, or repeatedly providing the same information, answers, and updates. And I will say, not all of the time spent on all these activities is unproductive by any means, but I think that a lot of it can be streamlined. For example, when you look at managing internal communication and collaboration, that is obviously critical, especially in a virtual or hybrid environment. But when it's taking up almost 10% of the average work week, it probably requires some attention to see if there are inefficiencies and steps that could be collapsed. Similarly, people are always going to spend time looking for information and expertise, but 4.5 hours a week seems like a lot, especially when you pair that with the level of frustration we see around findability problems and inefficient search and discovery processes. And then this 3.7 hours a week that people are spending recreating work and information that already exists elsewhere in the organization, or repeatedly providing the same answers, the same updates to different systems, to different people, that feels almost all like waste to me. There's inefficiencies that could be vastly improved by fewer silos, better access to enterprise knowledge, and moving communication into one-to-many forums so that if you answer a question in a community practice, for example, you can refer back to that answer. Other people can search for that, and you're not having to send the same thing out via email or phone call or conversation. And when you add up all of these categories, you get to nearly 12 hours per week per knowledge worker. And even if you say only half of that or only a third of that time is avoidable waste, it's still a huge number. And I think it can help organizations get their head around what they're losing by not taking a strategic look at how knowledge moves across peoples and systems and what they can do to optimize that knowledge flow. And then senior leaders aren't always sold on this being an urgent problem, but individual knowledge workers, I think, are keenly aware of it, not just in terms of productivity, but also in terms of organizational risk. Similar to what we saw on the process side, a majority of knowledge workers say that a lot of the knowledge they use to do their work is only in their heads. So there's no documentation. It's not accessible beyond calling them up and asking them. And if they leave, it's gone. If they left tomorrow, their organization would lose a lot of valuable knowledge. And then more than half say that their productivity is directly hurt by challenges finding and accessing information. So they perceive those time drains that we saw on the last slide. And a fairly substantive minority, about 41%, say those challenges have increased over the last 2 years between rapidly changing business strategies and obviously the move to more remote and hybrid work. And our survey respondents report a huge range of impacts from these issues, from less time for creativity and innovation, less time for learning, slower problem resolution at the organizational level, less agility, and lower quality. So the impacts are real. So as G.I. Joe would tell us, knowing is half the battle. Bad KM is creating real pain, both for individuals and organizations, I think. So the next logical question is what do we do about it? And we asked about a lot of different KM interventions on the survey, from communities of practice to content management. But there were 3 that really seemed to have the biggest impact on personal productivity outcomes. The first is getting critical knowledge out of people's heads so that it's documented and accessible. The second is facilitating mentoring and coaching to allow colleagues to help one another figure out how to be more productive. And then finally, investing in an enterprise or centralized search solution. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. So only 37% of the knowledge workers we surveyed said that their organizations have documented critical knowledge related to their work. But those 37% were much less likely to say that their knowledge exists only in their heads. That makes sense. And they're also less likely to say that their productivity is hurt by challenges finding and accessing information. And when you look at people whose knowledge is undocumented, they spend significantly more time recreating knowledge that already exists elsewhere in the organization and providing duplicate information or repeating the same answers and updates. So I think you can see the real inefficiency here. When knowledge isn't documented, people are constantly reinventing the wheel instead of using relevant information, relevant IP across projects, locations, initiatives. And when people's brains are your system of record, those people waste a lot of time sharing what they know over and over again, whether that's status updates on their work or answering the same basic questions for newbies or less experienced people. So when you look at documenting critical knowledge, you're not just saving time for knowledge workers. I think you're saving time for some of your subject matter experts, your experienced people, your sources of knowledge, because they're often the people who are recreating complex work products for you or doling out knowledge to other people. The next solution that I want to highlight here is around peer mentoring and coaching. And of all of the productivity interventions we asked about, this one and the personal empowerment piece that Holly ended with were the two that popped over and over again as decreasing every negative impact and improving every positive outcome to productivity, pretty much across the board. And mentoring and coaching seems to be particularly effective in connecting people to knowledge and answers. People are less likely to say that findability hurts their productivity, and they spend less time recreating and duplicating knowledge. And it also helps people pass on their knowledge and build their networks so that they spend less time seeking out the right person to answer questions or provide expertise. And all of you KMers out there may be asking yourself, is peer mentoring and coaching around productivity really a core function of KM? And I would say no, but maybe it should be. All of you on our latest trend survey said that productivity was the #1 business priority, that it was important for KM to support right now. And HR and learning tend to sponsor more formal mentoring, but I actually think this kind of productivity mentoring makes a lot of sense in the context of communities of practice, virtual networks, knowledge sharing events, and the kind of approaches that KM brings to the table. For example, if you have a project management community of practice, you'll probably have people posting questions, about how to keep their projects moving, whether that means being more productive as project managers or helping their teams be more productive. And other project managers in that community probably have great advice for that kind of productivity because it's so contextual, and the advice, really makes sense in the flow of those types of conversations. So just having discipline-based communities and networks in place helps facilitate those conversations. But I also think as KMers, we could be more intentional in facilitating that kind of coaching and mentoring. So many employees are struggling with huge workloads right now. And it may make sense to host some conversation threads, some Ask Me Anything forums, some webinars around different aspects of personal productivity that will be relevant to people working in a particular role or in a particular discipline. And I actually think this is a good way for communities and networks to be relevant to those immediate and pressing needs right now. And then the third piece that I wanted to talk about that makes a massive difference in terms of both productivity itself and perceptions of productivity is whether someone's organization had implemented an enterprise search tool to scan across systems and platforms. Respondents with enterprise search were significantly less likely to feel like their knowledge was all in their heads or that their productivity was directly hurt by finding and accessing information. But the most interesting part for me here and the data that I put in this chart is the psychological impact of how people feel about their productivity. Respondents with access to enterprise search were significantly less likely to say that productivity problems result in too much time working, in too much time on repetitive or manual tasks, or an increased likelihood that productivity challenges would cause them to leave their current organization. And my takeaway here is that people really hate wasting time looking for stuff. Our other research says that on average, organizations have 5 or more different places where people have to go to search for different types of information in the course of their work. And people who are used to Google, that just drives them crazy. People waste time on a lot of stuff, but time wasted on search makes a real mental impression on them. And obviously there is real time savings from implementing good enterprise search, But the reduction in frustration might be even more profound in this concept. Which leads me to the last finding that I wanted to highlight. So when we look at enterprise search, it doesn't just help people save time on non-value added tasks. It also really matters to the overall experience people have at work. And we find similar results when we look at knowledge workers who organizations have knowledge management programs in place. Those workers are significantly less likely to report that productivity problems increase their frustration and stress, lower their job satisfaction, and make them more likely to leave and seek out greener pastures. I can't tell exactly what's driving these correlations, but I do think that as we spend more time in the digital workplace, knowledge and information management is becoming more critical to the overall employee experience. Most organizations wouldn't ask people to work in a dirty, disorganized office where you have to spend 20 minutes digging through garbage to find a paperclip. And I think that we really are asking people to do the equivalent in some of our digital environments. And that not only makes people less productive, it has a real impact, but it also makes them feel like the organization isn't invested in them and their experience. And it makes them less invested in the organization. And I think some of that is true on the process side as well, Holly. Would you agree?
Definitely, especially organizations that have BPM programs are a lot less likely to also feel frustrated because they're able to understand how they're supposed to execute their work. And I think the other one that came up really closely linked here with that job satisfaction and the likelihood of leaving the organization and reducing those was the streamlining and simplification of processes as well.
Yeah. So I don't know how that plays out at your organization, but I definitely think it's worth doing some internal surveys and focus groups to understand how bad process, how bad KM are affecting the employee experience, maybe having an impact on retention risks, especially in this era of the Great Resignation, where we're all laser focused on what we can do to recruit and retain the best talent. So I think we should skip over our final poll, Holly, and because I know we've got some questions here, and I want to make sure we address at least a couple of those before we have to end. Does that make sense?
Completely makes sense.
So, was there anything that jumped out to you? I haven't looked in here for a little while.
Right. Well, and Marcia just made a comment about how process and systems tend to get laid down first, and then the knowledge get put on top of them as kind of part of that correlation aspect there. We had a quick, simple question that was kind of asking about, let me find the right one, asking about, as far as the respondents go, 50% of the respondents had dedicated BPM programs, and 43% of the respondents had a dedicated knowledge management program.
And you can see the data cut in pretty much any way you want, by gender, by generation, by whether people work virtually or in person. We've looked at it from all those different perspectives, and we've got some of those insights in the resource library as well. I like this question. Have you looked at how the tyranny of now drives ad hoc processes and poor KM? I think that the way that I have seen this really play out since the onset of the pandemic is some organizations have decided that their burning platforms are elsewhere, and they have abandoned what they were doing around knowledge management. I don't know if you've seen the same, Holly, on process. And then other ones have really realized that, oh, this is a critical success factor now that we're working more remotely, now that we are dealing with rapid change. So it's been very polarizing in some of the data. Is that your experience as well, Holly?
I think at first, yeah, everybody's work on dealing with all the process stuff that they had lined up, their whole agenda for the year got blown up. But the benefit was actually that process teams then got tapped into all of those technology implementations, as well as restructuring how work's getting accomplished in this hybrid environment or during whatever kind of transformation the organization is going through now. So it has been kind of put for the tyranny of now, but to an extent, it's also helped elevate the work that the groups are doing.
So here's here's a question. How do we organize the documentation and knowledge so that teams aren't overwhelmed as they need to know so much and it is also evolving? Both the teams and the knowledge is not standing still. So I think that's a great question. I don't have a silver bullet answer. I definitely think that, and Holly, you and I have talked about this a lot. You've got to be intentional in what you document and how you document it, especially for things that are changing very quickly. Stability of knowledge is definitely a factor that we look at in terms of whether you want a more formal or more organic approach to documentation. Some of that really fast moving knowledge may make sense to document in the context of a community or a network rather than creating a whole bunch of SOPs and things like that. You know, and just kind of being smart about, okay, this is something that people are definitely going to need to know and isn't going to change that much in a year, or this is all going to be out the window in 2 months. We need to capture it, but there, you know, maybe we do that in a more collaborative way, in a more agile way. And I certainly think in terms of the organization, we are just seeing content management and search come to a tipping point in organizations. There's too much information and people are frustrated with their inability to access it. And this is a place where people just really need to invest in roles and responsibilities and content life cycles and enterprise search and a whole bunch of people, process, and technology things to fix those problems.
We also, from the process side of the house, see it a little different, which is making sure developing process repositories, right? We've done that. We make the maps, we identify the RACI charts, we did ZIPOCs, but they're expanding those to also include all that process related knowledge, right? What are the standard operating works? What are the business rules? And having them then put in there as links. So they're being fed up as well at the same time that the person is looking at, how do I execute this process? Now we've done a couple of case studies at looking at, and Lauren's going to shudder at this, people have used the process classification framework to structure their SharePoint site. So it has the process, it shows the steps, and then it has their desktop procedures as well as all the business rules and all the forms and the templates they need to execute that particular process.
There's so many good questions and comments in here, and we will follow up individually if there is anything that that you've asked that we need to answer. But I know we are at time, so I want to let you all know that we've got white papers, survey reports, articles, podcasts, all sorts of different data cuts and infographics and different ways to look at this research in our research collection. And so I encourage you all to look at that, get in touch with us, get in touch with APQC, and I hope you have a great end of 2021, and we will hopefully see you all in 2022 on one of our APQC webinars. Take care.